In our Bible class this morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. Good to see a lot of good catching up conversation. Have some new faces in our Bible study this morning, but then also a lot of familiar ones. Thank you all for being here to study God's Word together this morning. Go opening in your Bibles to the Gospel of John chapter 11. John chapter 11 is where we're going to be studying this morning together. Just a few things, again, before we go ahead and open up in prayer and jump into our text. Again, for those of you who weren't here on Wednesday, I announced I'm going to try to do my very best to be much better ahead on the questions. That's a goal I'm working towards, not in addition to just doing the questions. But I'm going to start putting the questions on the back table back there. The back table is now where you'll be able to find the family report, the bulletins as I continue to work those in, and the questions. And if I do real good in a week, you'll have the next following class period's questions as well. And so if you need a list of the questions we're going to be going over this morning for our chapters, you can find them back there. Again, the questions, all they simply are meant to do is for us to read the text together, and then the questions are there to kind of help us dive deeper, perhaps jog our minds to think about the text that we just read is the intention and purpose of the question this morning. So keep that in mind as we continue forward with the Bible class, and some of these changes I'm working into adding to help the Bible class be more fruitful for us as we continue to grow in God's Word together. So be looking for that. We're going to go ahead and open up in a word of prayer, and then we're going to jump into our text of John chapter 11 this morning. If you would, please bow with me. Our dear awesome God and Father, we are so very grateful for another opportunity this morning to come together at this time to study a portion of your word. We thank you for all the hearts and souls that have made their way here this morning, that were committed to coming and studying with the brethren here. We thank you for the brethren that are here in Lake Wales. We thank you that there are people who are faithful to you and that are committing their lives to not only deepening their relationship with you, but also encouraging others in this pursuit as well. We thank you for your word and all that it has to offer to us, to teach us about you, to teach us about your character, to teach us how we can be pleasing to you, to teach us how you have brought salvation to us, how we had damaged our relationship with you, but how you, despite that, made it right. We thank you for all the things that your word does for us in transforming us into the image of your Son, Jesus Christ. As we study John 11 this morning, we pray that you'd help us to humble our hearts and our souls and our minds to the teaching that we have recorded here about Jesus raising Lazarus. Help us to learn from this example, that we may take this and add this to our faith and use it to also spread your word. As far as the work here, Lord, we pray that you would continue to help us to grow. Help us to grow spiritually, and if it be your will, numerically. Send us elders, Lord. Send us men who are ready and willing to fulfill that role, that this church may grow. But we also ask, Lord, that you would just everywhere send us seekers. Send us those who are seeking the truth, that we can bring them into contact with your Son, Jesus Christ. Help us to be matchmakers for your Son, Jesus Christ, that they may come to know him, knowing that he already loves them. All these things we pray through your Son, Jesus Christ, this morning. Amen. Alrighty, Gospel of John chapter 11 is where we are this morning. And of course, as we said and stated in our prayer, John 11 is where we have recorded for us the death of Lazarus, the death and resurrection of Lazarus. And so that's what we're going to be studying this morning. If you look at the handout I provided in the introduction section, just a few points to make before we go ahead and jump into our text. As I was saying on Wednesday night, John 11 is a turning point in the Gospel of John. Thus far, up until this point, in chapters 1 through 10, we're learning a lot about who God is, who Jesus is. And later on, when we get to chapter 14, Jesus will make the point that by knowing me, you now know the Father. And so as we see Jesus doing his ministry and teaching, we see a lot of controversy surrounding his teaching. How are the people reacting to Jesus? That is the thing we have constantly been looking at. And we're going to look at that one last time, with this being the last and final controversy. And now after this, the pacing is going to slow down dramatically in the Gospel of John. This is, you get the sense that all the miracles that Jesus had been doing, all of his teaching, is almost leading up to this point of the death of Lazarus. Because after this, immediately, we will see the Jews have finally committed to, we're going to get this guy out. we're going to kill Jesus. We've seen them say that several times already at this point, but we will see that they are committed now at the end of this chapter to killing Jesus. And so that's kind of where we are in the big picture of the narrative of Gospel of John. The pacing will slow down, and you'll notice on the handout I have that by chapter 13, we will already be on the last night in which the Lord is betrayed. And you have 9 chapters, again, from there until the end of the book. So the pacing will slow down dramatically. Also observe that, in some of the readings I've done on chapter 11 here, some scholars have suggested that about 4 months have gone by from the events of chapter 10 to chapter 11. So there's been a bit of time that has passed as we come from here, and we'll see that again as we make some observations on the text in just a moment. Another few interesting points about John 11, only John records the death of Lazarus. This chapter here, this event that we're about to read of, this is unique to the Gospel of John. And so certainly when we look and read here, let's look and see how many observations we can make. What is John trying to communicate? Again, just kind of drawing our minds back to the main point of the book. Why is John writing this gospel? What have we emphasized several times as we've studied Gospel of John together? What is John's purpose for writing his gospel? Yeah, John is writing his gospel so that we believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So again, John is recording this so that we may believe. That's the big point that John is trying to communicate to his readers. And then certainly, looking at the death and resurrection of Lazarus, there are certainly many parallels that we can draw to also Christ's death and resurrection. But also, this is a foreshadowing of the spiritual death, or the killing off of the old man that all Christians must experience to become children of God. Though we die, we live eternally, spiritually. And we'll see that some of those points subtly emphasized as we look through the death of Lazarus here. Does anybody have any questions or observations about the big picture of the book before we jump into our text? All right, let's go ahead and jump in. John 11. We're going to start by reading verses 1 through 16 and then asking a few questions on this section. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going to go there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in his sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Verses 1 through 16 here, again, the chapter jumps straight to the point. The big thing of what we're going to be talking about this morning, Lazarus dies. You see quite a few things about Jesus' relationship with Mary, Martha, Lazarus. Certainly Jesus cares about them, but there's certainly some questions that come to mind as we read through this. And so let's kind of go working verse by verse and just see how we can dive deeper. What questions can we ask ourselves to help us gain deeper meaning in what we just read? So I want to start by looking at verse 2 and some details about Mary here. It said, John records for us in verse 2 that Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. If you're curious about where that's recorded, you can find that recording in Luke 7, 36 through 50, and I have that provided for you on the handout. But certainly, again, John, he's wanting us to connect. This is the same person. And so if you're interested in drawing all those cross references, that would be a good one to draw to Mary to make the connection between her here. But I want to start by asking a question about verse 4. Let's read verse 4 again. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now certainly, again, you have this context. Mary and Martha, they're reaching out to Jesus. They're like, hey, Lazarus is ill. Why don't you come? Why don't you heal him? This is certainly not the first time Jesus has been healing people. We've been reading of so many examples of Jesus healing people. Back in chapter 9, we just read of Jesus healing the blind man, and many more that we've read about in the previous chapters. And so certainly with Jesus, we've talked about before how Jesus is a famous character at this point. Everybody's hearing about him. Even the common man knows, hey, this guy, at the very least, this is the guy that the Pharisees are trying to kill. And so people know about Jesus. People know what he's been up to. They generally know what he's teaching and what he's giving out to the common people as he goes around teaching. And certainly Jesus' healing would have also been among the things that are widely known about him. So it's not unusual for Mary and Martha to reach out to him, but Jesus' response to their words certainly, I think, is a little bit unusual. What does he mean by what he says in verse 4? What kind of death is he alluding to? What do you think? What kind of death is Jesus alluding to in verse 4? I'm sorry? Spiritual? I certainly think there's an argument to be made for that. I guess the reason in asking this question is, looking at a bird's eye view for us as readers, does Lazarus die? Absolutely. And so you got to ask the question, he's saying, hey, this illness doesn't lead to death, but he died. So what is Jesus referring to when he says it doesn't refer to death? I do think he's saying that this is going to lead to Lazarus' spiritual death. But then also you got to realize and ask the question, does everybody else know that by Jesus' words? And I certainly don't think that everybody's making this connection that, oh, he's talking about spiritual death. Jesus' words, just like everything he teaches, it doesn't always click with people right away. In fact, a lot of times it doesn't click with them until after he's already died and been raised from the dead himself. And so certainly John is writing these things again so that we may believe, and for us as readers, we have the advantage of being able to know he says this, despite the fact that Lazarus does die, he probably is referring to something else other than physical death here. Thoughts, comments, questions about that? Charlie, yeah, go ahead.
When he speaks of his own resurrection, he speaks of a complete resurrection, whereas I think Lazarus is not completely dead, going through the whole process. I think that's what Jesus may be referring to.
Would you care to elaborate on that? I've not quite thought about that in that way. I'm just curious what you think.
Let's see. Well, we have a limited knowledge of death.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, certainly. And zooming out from the text for a second, certainly John 11 is one of those chapters of the Bible that it certainly is touching on the subject quite a bit. We're all curious about what happens after death. At least I'm curious. I hope we're all curious. Patty, did you have something you wanted to add to what Charlie was saying, or Sammy in general?
My reference says, not unto death means not having death as its final result.
Okay, yeah, so certainly this is not going to be his eternal state. It's his final state. He's going to be risen from the dead. He's not going to stay in the grave for very long. It's not where he's going to stay now that he's died. So again, I think that's certainly going towards the idea of a spiritual death, or not a physical death here, but he's referring to this is not going to lead to ultimate spiritual death. This is not going to be his eternal state here. But going back to what I was just saying about the subject of death as well, again, you look at what other people of different beliefs have. And in a lot of those beliefs, there's not very much accountability for what happens after death. And yet that's something we're very curious about. An advantage the Christian has is that the Bible addresses that. The Bible does give us a hope beyond death. But in many other belief systems, there isn't much of a hope after death. And so certainly, again, in the big picture of the world we live in today, for those who particularly are terrified or struggle with this aspect of reality, what happens beyond death, we can certainly find comfort in what the Bible teaches about death, that it teaches anything at all about life after death. And so that's something that I think is very interesting about specifically the Christian faith, that we can have a faith, we can have confidence beyond death. Russell, did you want to add to that?
Genesis to here, all man has known is physical death. It was the curse that God set on man from the beginning. This is going to be the first public display of resurrection that occurs. And it's to actually herald in what Christ is going to do by his death, which is the resurrection of all men. So that's what he's talking about here, is that it is spiritual salvation, but it is also a resurrection of man, true, and this is him demonstrating what he's going to be able to do for us.
Yeah, certainly. This whole miracle here shows the power of God and what he is not, what you might think he might be limited by. He's not limited by this barrier of death, certainly. His power goes beyond that. And certainly, as you were saying, this is going to be what Christ is going to accomplish ultimately in all of us, just as he also accomplished in himself. Good questions and observations. Charlie, did you want to go add on to that?
It may get into the fact that he had not begun to permanently decompose.
Are you talking about Lazarus?
Yes. His tissues had not started dissolving.
Okay, yeah.
And he was actually, for Jesus' purposes, he was actually asleep.
Oh, yeah. We're going to comment on that in just a second.
Everything had stopped, including the normal processes of decomposition.
Yeah, certainly, I think there's a little bit here of the normal process of decomposition. You will see again as we go through the text, when Jesus goes to raise Lazarus, they comment on, hey, there's going to be an odor about this. So they're thinking about that as well. But certainly, it's not like he's been in there for a year or something like that. And so there's a whole lot more decomposition that takes place. He kind of just comes right back from where he was. And so certainly that's another good observation to make, that the timing of this as well is interesting. Russell?
Writings, I can't point you to them, but there are writings about Jewish mysticism and where it talks about the spirit departs the body after 3 days. And that actually plays into Christ's death, burial, resurrection, that it was over the course of 3 days, proving that he could bring the spirit back to the body even after the mystics said that the spirit had departed. And he's also proving that here. This is 4 days. So
Yeah.
That's also a point of what he's talking about. He's able to join both body and spirit, even after man says that it can't be done. So,
Well, now you've done it, Russell. Now I'm excited. I'm curious about
that there are writings by Jewish mystics about that. So,
Yeah, I'll have to do something and see if I can find anything on that. Any other comments, observations on anything we've talked about thus far? Alrighty, and then also according to verse 4, we want to also take note of what purpose does Jesus give for all this happening to Lazarus? What is his purpose? What is the purpose in this happening to him? He gives us a reason in verse 4. Yeah, so again, you think about what John's purpose is in writing this book. All of this is so that we would believe, and certainly Jesus says this is going to happen so that Jesus would be glorified, so that the Son of Man, the Son of God, would be glorified through it as well. So we have a purpose here in why this happens. And again, I want to draw back to that in just a moment when we get and start to look at Mary and Martha. But keep that in mind. Jesus gives a reason here for why this happens specifically this way. It's so that the Son of God would be glorified. Alrighty, next question. If Jesus knew that Lazarus was ill in verse 6, why would he wait 2 more days? Any thoughts on that?
Verse 4.
Okay. Yeah, verse 4. So certainly it's according to his purpose. Other thoughts on that, though? Yeah, Charlie.
Having suffered a personal tragedy with my family, about 4 days is what they give you if you have a portion of your brain that's dead.
Okay.
You've gone beyond resuscitation.
Okay, so it seems medically after 4 days, that seems that there's no coming back after that, is what you're trying to say. Okay, interesting observation. Other thoughts on why Jesus might have waited? Yeah, Jim.
Well, I was wondering, because Jonah was 3 days in the fish, Christ was 3 days in the tomb. Why the 4 days? But I guess Russell kind of touched on that, because it's not 4 days by accident. There's a reason for the 4 days.
Yeah, Jesus doesn't ever seem to not have a reason for
Yeah, so I'm just, not sure what the reason is for 4 days rather than 3. Everything else seems to be 3.
Yeah, certainly. The text doesn't give us a very clear and very specific reason why he waits 2 more days, but certainly here's some observations that we can draw on this. He waits 2 more days. Again, I think this will play into what Mary and Martha say to Jesus when they come into contact with him as well. But also Russell commenting on the 4 days is when Jesus goes to raise him from the dead. You make good observation, a good connection between Jesus and Jonah. Certainly, Jesus comments on that, I believe, in the book of Matthew to the Jews questioning him. This is the sign you're going to receive. It's the sign of Jonah. And so he's referring to himself how he's going to be in the grave for 3 days, just as Jonah was in the belly for 3 days. But this is something different as well. Jesus raises Lazarus on the 4th day, and perhaps even in the context, if there is... Did you want to comment on that, Nathan?
I was going to answer your question.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I think another reason why he waited is to test Mary and Martha, because he does say that the illness doesn't lead to death, and if he just healed them right there, they might not fully understand what he means by that.
Yeah.
So he wants to test them to see if they're going to doubt him after Lazarus dies.
Yeah, and that's a good observation as well. I certainly think that's definitely part of it as well. But even also commenting on what Russell was saying about the 4 days too, if in the Jews' cultural context, they thought that 3 days was kind of it, and then the spirit was going to leave, but then Jesus still brings Lazarus' spirit back to him, because what is life? It is the body and the spirit together. Death is separation of the body and the soul. Even Jesus beyond that is able to bring a man back to life with that. So I certainly think there's some of that as well at play. But again, Jesus has many reasons, not all of which are disclosed to us, but I certainly think some of these observations are safe inferences to make. Jesus is doing this for a purpose. This isn't just for reasons only known to him that, just to make other people struggle. He has a reason. And certainly he will use those reasons also for teaching other people as well, I certainly think is what it's at play here. Any other comments, observation on that? All right. Notice verse 10. Hold on a second. Notice how the disciples recall the events of John 10. Let's see, looking at verse 12. The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus spoke of his death. I'm getting tripped up in my own thinking here. I'm looking for the verse here about him going back. Verse 8 is what I'm looking for. The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. And are you going to go there again?" So Jesus, says, "Hey, let's go to Bethany. Let's go see Lazarus. I'm going to go wake him up." And the disciples seem pretty reluctant to go be there. And the reason they give is that, hey, the Jews were just trying to stone you. But they also say that they were just now seeking to stone you. And so, again, something I came across in readings up on chapter 11 here, some have used this as a point of criticism for this text here. Well, some have said that it's, there's a 4-month period in between the events of chapter 10 and 11, but the Jews say that they were just now seeking to kill him. So obviously there's a contradiction here. But that doesn't really match. I mean, the way we talk about things as well. Events can be relatively recent, and that could be a month ago, that could be 2 months ago, that could be 2 years ago sometimes, and we talk that way sometimes. And so I don't think that's a very strong argument here that I've come across in my readings that this text is not, or that there's that there is a contradiction here with the timing of things there. But certainly just observe the disciples seem a little bit reluctant to go forward, but they also are commenting on the events that happened in verse 10 when the Jews were going to stone Jesus and he slipped through the fingers once again. Also, we want to ask the question, why does Jesus use the analogy of sleep to tell the disciples that Lazarus has died? Charlie, I think, commented on that earlier, but according to Jesus, he's just asleep. So why would Jesus use that analogy to describe Lazarus' death here? thoughts on that? Yes, ma'am.
I don't want to allude to the fact that he's going to bring him back because sleep isn't permanent and he wants to show that there's something coming that he will be risen.
I certainly think that's part of it as well, but also keep in mind, this is not the only time we see this analogy used specifically for people who have died. Also, Paul will use this same analogy in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, and we're not going to go there and read it. We don't have time to do that this morning. But for those of you who were here when we studied 1 Thessalonians together, you'll remember Paul, in his argumentation in 1 Thessalonians 4, he says, I want you to know about what has happened to those who have gone before us, to those who have fallen asleep, and that they're also going to be raised. And so certainly, again, this is not the only time, the only place we see this analogy being used to equate it with death. But certainly, I think in this context as well, Jesus is alluding to, if he's just asleep, he's going to wake up at some point. He's not permanently sleeping in the grave. He's going to rise again. And so certainly, I think he's throwing out quite a few hints that he's going to go raise Lazarus from the dead. And then he'll tell them that plainly as we see the conversation go or develop further. So good observation. Other thoughts on perhaps why Jesus might use the analogy of sleep. Is there anything... Hold on. What am I thinking here for a second? Don't you hate when that happens? You lose your train of thought for a second. I'm going to move on. I forgot what I was going to say. Maybe it'll come back to me. This is not the only place we see the analogy of sleep used here. But I want to ask another question. What can Jesus' words here about sleep and death teach us about death? Is death... certainly, again, we were just commenting on how Christians can have a faith, we can have a confidence, we can have a hope that goes beyond death. Not everybody can have that. Depends on what your worldview says. If you believe there is life after death, if you don't believe there's life after death, that certainly can be a very encouraging or discouraging thing. But certainly, again, this gives us some insight of what the Bible teaches about life after death. What are some lessons? What are some things that you think this can teach us about death? Gigi, did I see your hand go up?
Just that it's not a permanent sleep because our soul continues. So although our body is asleep and not functioning anymore, we are functioning.
Yeah. So it's not permanent. Else, yeah, Nate, go ahead.
A lot of people are afraid of death. Not many people are afraid of sleep. You might also be trying to tell them there's nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah, I think you're onto something with that as well. Again, putting this in the context of death, does the Christian have real reason to be afraid of death? Spiritually, no. And so that's something else I think that this analogy can teach us, that it's not something to fear. We can have that confidence. You think about in Revelation, all these Christians who are facing Roman imperialism. You got to worship the emperor or else we're going to come and kill you. Think about the emperors who went on a wide Christian genocide. And people were willing to die for the cause of Christ. You think about it might be a little easier to do that if you're believing that there's something waiting for you beyond the scope of death. But if death is all that there is, that better be the most terrifying thing to you. You better be afraid of that. But the Christian doesn't have to fear that because we have a hope beyond that as well. And so certainly when we put that in perspective, that can help take away some of it as well. Yeah, Russell.
It's a parallelism. You're talking about something that is temporary with sleep, whereas the unbelievers, all they have is death. And when you're dead all over like Rover. That's it. It's fine. And there's nothing. So there is hope in something that can change, like sleep, where you can be awake or awake. So I don't believe that. I believe that it's intentional when the writers always slip that in. It's not just Paul and it's not Christ here. It's even in the Old Testament. They talk about people going to sleep with their father.
Really, I have to dive deeper on that. I'm not familiar with the references to the Old Testament, but that's something else to study. So. Any other thoughts on death and sleep here? Yeah, Charlie.
Verse 11 is very powerful, and if we compare it to our aging lives, Jesus said, "My friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up." He's going to wake us up someday.
Yeah.
To an eternal life.
Absolutely true. And not only that, one of the last thing about death that we were taught as well, we're also told we're going to get a new body as well. So fearing the death that happens to this body, we're told we're going to be remade again in a body that's just like Christ and in the body that was resurrected with his as well. So that's something else to look forward to. It goes in with Christian theology about life after death. All right, we are running way out of time to get through chapter 11. Let's go ahead and jump to verse 17. Let's read through this. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha had heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." A few quick observational questions here about Martha is crying out to Jesus here. In verse 21, is Martha giving a statement of faith, or is she kind of, "Jesus, where were you when we needed you," kind of thing? What do you guys think about that?
I think she's giving a little bit of both.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a bit of both. But she asked a very good question. You ever feel like that with Martha? "Jesus, where are you when I need you?" I think we all feel that at some time. And so certainly her question here, it's not unusual. But also the fact that Jesus allows her to just even say something like that to her, he wants us to emotionally engage with him. That, "Hey, where were you? No, you were working on your timetable, knowing full well something that I don't." Nathan, did you comment on that?
Stories in the Bible, the story of Job, super faithful, even he questions God a couple times, because that's just kind of what humans do.
God allows us to ask questions. He doesn't say, "Hey, God, don't question." He allows us to ask questions. To emotionally engage with him that way. "Lord, what are you doing? Do I have the faith and the trust that even though I can't see what you're doing right now, when I feel like I need you right now and it seems like you're not doing anything, that really you're working behind the scenes beyond what I'm seeing?" Kevin, did you want to comment on that?
Remember, she's going through all sorts of emotions. And so, because it's funny how she says, "If you had been here, you wouldn't have died." Then she turns around and says, "Yet even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." So it's like, I know you can still do something. But then turn around again and she says, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day." So it's like, now it's back to, I don't know if he can physically do this. So again, I mean, she's in this,
Yeah.
I mean, her brother, who she was supposed to, is dead, and so she's going through all sorts of emotions.
Yeah, and I want to comment on that further as well. I asked you another question. What did Martha know about the resurrection? She certainly, like you said, she seems to be in this weird place. I know you can still do something, but maybe it's, you're just going to raise him up again on the resurrection of the last day. But to my knowledge, this is the first time that I personally am aware of seeing a statement where someone comments on the resurrection of the last day that's not actively teaching someone. Nathan, did you want to add to that, or?
Another, really kind of crazy viewpoint on it is when she says to him that if you were here, my brother wouldn't have died. It could also be praising Jesus. She could be saying, if you were here, I know there was no chance of him dying. She might not be quite as upset with him either.
Yeah.
It might be a praise.
It certainly, again, it really could be in somewhere between all of that. She certainly is demonstrating, hey, I know that you have the power to stop this kind of stuff. You've healed people before. You have the power to do something about this. If you had been here, maybe it would have been that he wouldn't have died because you've done stuff like that before. Yeah, Charlie.
We wouldn't have had to go through all this mess. I mean, we had to wash him, we had to spice him, we had to wrap him. If you'd have been here, we avoided all that.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it as well. Okay, returning back to our question, what did Martha know about the resurrection? Let me ask another question. Did anyone back then believe in a resurrection? Yeah, I don't think they understood, but there is some sort of belief that was held about the resurrection. We can see references of that here in Acts 23, verse 8, and 24, verse 15. Acts 23, verse 8 tells us that the Sadducees held the belief that there was no resurrection, but the Pharisees did believe that. And then also 24, verse 15 comments on that as well. So even among the Jewish sects, there are different beliefs in resurrection. The Sadducees believe that there is no resurrection. The Pharisees do believe there's a resurrection, but that doesn't mean they understand it completely at all. And so, again, an observation to make, it seems as though Martha here seems to hold the same Pharisaic belief on resurrection, that there at least is one, because the Sadducees didn't believe there was one at all, even though Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Jim, did you have a comment on that? No? Okay. So that's another observation to make here about what did she already know, what did she believe about that. Jesus reassures her that Lazarus will rise again in verse 23, and then also verse 25. Jesus gives another very unique statement here. I am the resurrection and the life. Does those first few words sound like anything else Jesus has said before?
I believe it's 7 I.M. statements in the book.
There's, well, you know that there's only 7. Man, more studying than away from me to do. But again, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Further back in John 6, it was John 6, Jesus gave his teaching on the bread of life. He says, I am the bread of life. But then also back in chapter 8, he gave another statement saying that before Abraham was, I am. He's pointing himself to God here. And so certainly with his statement here, he's not only just giving teaching here about himself, but he's also reassuring Martha here. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who believes in me shall never die. So certainly that's another part of who Jesus is and his character, who God is. He is the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's all those big statements like that that are very important for us to recognize as a part of Jesus' character as God. Comments, questions on that?
I like that he describes himself as I am, because that, in my mind, he's saying that all the laws that bind you in this creation, they don't apply to me at all because I created. So time, space, matter, all of that means nothing to me, and I have all power over all things in the creation, including death. What you look at is permanent. But
It's not. Again, powerful statements about Jesus and him being God here. All right, let's go to verse 28. Jesus weeps. We'll see Mary comes into contact with Jesus here. I do want to make note of there are extra Jews that follow Mary here. We're going to make a few comments on that as we move forward. But verse 28. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying? Certainly, again, Mary responds in the same way as Martha did. Jesus, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But I also want to look and take note of what is said about Jesus here. They make the observation that Jesus loved him. Some of them are saying that. But then notice verse 37. Some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying?" Nathan.
This question, when you asked why Jesus waited, he also might have had to wait for physical reasons, because it seems in these few verses that he almost would have rather been there sooner. Like, he feels very bad for Mary when she's weeping to him.
Yeah, he's certainly compassionate about it. But verse 37, there's an assumption here. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying? There's an assumption here. And what is that assumption that we see both Mary and Martha have, but also the Jews around him? What is the kind of underlying assumption here about Jesus? Yeah, I certainly think the scoffing Jews are trying to make that point about him here. But also, you notice there's just this expectation that it's almost like they can't grasp the idea that Jesus can do something for him after he's died. They're expecting him to have done something before he died to stop him from reaching death. And again, he's not meeting their expectation, just as Jesus does in many other places, not meeting the common person's expectation. But their expectation seems to be, hey, if you had been here, you would have stopped this from happening instead of just letting it happen. It's almost as if they don't have a concept, or they're not even considering any possibilities beyond Lazarus dying. And so I think that also plays into, again, what do they understand about life after death? There seems to be this gray area. Some believe that there's going to be a resurrection at the end, but even Martha doesn't seem to grasp the concept of, hey, he might actually raise him from the dead now before that ultimate resurrection. So that's an observation here I think we need to make in the text about their belief. Certainly there are those who do believe that are kind of wrestling with that, but also those who don't believe, using that as more fuel for the fire to say, hey, you sure this guy is who he says he is? As a way of expressing doubt. So that's another observation we want to make here. We are running out of time. Let's go ahead and go to verse 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him, let him go." Here we read Jesus raising Lazarus. For what purpose does John remind us why Jesus does the miracle the specific way he does? Again, it's so that the glory of God, or that Jesus would be glorified through this, and that people would come to believe in him. I certainly think that's the main observation we want to make here. Again, Jesus does this miracle in hopes that people would believe in him. And he says that in his prayer to God here. But I have another question that we can briefly talk about here. According to what Jesus says in verse 44, is death a type of prison? What do you think? And the way they're thinking about it, is death a type of prison? I'm sorry?
Prison or prison?
Yeah, prison. Like you put a criminal in prison. Yeah.
I think you could describe it as a holding cell.
Okay. It's a temporary waiting place. Someone recently enlightened me that there's a difference between jail and prison. That one is temporary and one is a more permanent location. So certainly with this here, there is this idea that Lazarus is temporarily in the grave. The reason I use this language is this a type of prison? There's a bit of teaching in this in 1 Peter chapter 3, where it is written that Jesus, when he dies, he goes beyond death, but it says that he goes to minister to the spirits in prison. And a lot of teaching around that refers to he's going to bring those out of spiritual death back to life. And so certainly there's an aspect of which death here is a type of prison. I'm going to make some last observations since we are out of time. Reading through the rest of the chapter, that's where we see the Jews, again, ultimately plan to kill Jesus. Yeah.
Going back up to where Jesus wept and everything. He looked at death differently than we look at death. And he's looking, because it says he's deeply troubled, or he's deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. He knew what he was going to do, but he's looking at it from the standpoint, this is his creation. And sin has come into this world. Why are they crying? Because of death. Something that he has now come to fix. And then moving on to removing the stone, he tells them he can remove the stone. He has them, God will never do for man what man can do for themselves. He says, you remove the stone. And so he tells, and so, again, again, he's looking at everything completely different, this death and the people crying, than how we view things.
Good. Those are some good observations. Goes on. We'll briefly go over the end of chapter 11 on Wednesday. But yeah, we'll finish up chapter 11 on Wednesday, and we'll go ahead and plan on chapter 12. I'll have the questions for you on Wednesday night, and again, working to get ahead. We'll see if we can get there. Thank you for your comments and questions this morning.